thank you all for joining. This is part of a series of Contino CloudFest. We continue with our thought leadership and thought-provoking content that we've looked to bring out to all of you in the last couple of weeks and months. Today we're going to be talking about a topic that's quite topical, quite popular out there, and frankly we've seen organizations struggle with, which is the content of the concept of financial agility. So today on the line you've got my colleague Scott Shulman from the States, and myself, Deepak Vensi from the UK. We'll be talking to you about the future being FinOps, right? How you can leverage finance and your cloud operations teams to bring together two functions that perhaps haven't necessarily spoken in the past in order to take your cloud adoption program totally up to the next level. Scott, next slide, please. So Scott, did you want to do an introduction to your team, who you are?
Absolutely. So we're globally as a partnership across the pond and in the U.S. I'm located in the East Coast, and I've been with Contino for a while, and I've got a number of years of expertise in the SMB, midsize, and enterprise space, and my practice expertise is in the FinOps.
Sure, thanks a lot, Scott. And hi all, Deepak Vensi, co-host for the day. So I'm also an account principal at Contino. I specialize in working with sort of regulated enterprises and making sure we can help you scale your cloud adoption journey using modern engineering and operational practices of site reliability engineering, DevSecOps, FinOps, and GitOps. And I'm fortunate to be able to present back to you guys one of those key pillars, that being of FinOps today. So Scott, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please.
Yep.
So for those of you who might not have known Contino, we won't spend too long on this, but we as Contino, we're a global digital engineering transformation who specializes in working with regulated organizations to help them transform digitally and build their own in-house digital capabilities going forwards. We started off a couple of years ago with no more than a handful of people in London and have been fortunate enough to grow to a big pool of experts spanning more than 400 people across 5 offices. We're based out, as Scott said, in the States and the UK, and also out in Asia Pacific across Sydney and Melbourne. And we've had the fortune of being able to work with more than 250 customers and having executed a plethora of engagements. And frankly, we've lost count now. It says 500 plus on the slides, but we've definitely lost count. And you can see some of the logos of the kind of organizations that we worked with. And a lot of the content that we'll be talking about today when it comes to FinOps has been built based on what we've heard out there from the industry, the pain that we've heard our customers mention, but also some of the success stories and some of the approaches that we frankly see work practically quite well when we look to translate the theory that's written on a book onto something that actually works for you when you're looking to execute that out. Scott, if you don't mind moving to the next slide, please.
Yep.
So the audience for the webinar, if you are wondering why is it that you are here today, FinOps as a content isn't actually something that's one for just engineering folks, but actually it spans a broad group of people. If you are someone who's a chief financial officer, you certainly would love to hear about this. If you're someone in the cloud engineering space, you definitely should care about it. And if you're people who are from a procurement background or a financial business partners who work with consuming IT teams on how to consume cloud at scale, you definitely will be interested in FinOps because it certainly has a big impact on the kind of role and the partnership that you bring to engineering teams going forwards. Yeah. So it's a broad audience, and the people who we have on the call today will make sure we cover the individual aspects that will be of interest to all of you.
Yes, it's definitely a partnership as it crosses the lines of business within an organization, and we see this on the SMB side all the way up to the enterprise class organizations.
Sure, thanks, Scott. Next slide, please. So today's webinar, you'll be glad to know we will actually be covering what FinOps is. So we'll give you a brief run through of the challenges around why FinOps came about as a concept and as a movement, and actually what it means to an organization in 2020. We'll introduce the concept of a financial trace and the importance behind it, but then also we'll look at how can you tangibly start looking at FinOps as a concept within your organization, get the buy-in within the leadership, and look at tangible next steps on how to build those building blocks out within your organization. We'll also touch upon what should be a North Star, what does good look like, and then we'll touch upon a community known as the FinOps Foundation that frankly has been a big driving force behind the notion of FinOps in the industry and making sure that's successfully seen as a function out there. For those of you who are actually going to stay on the webinar long enough, and do make sure that you do, there's actually a special guest on the webinar today, and frankly, if you wanted to know anything about FinOps, you wouldn't want to hear about anyone else but said person. So if you stick along long enough, we won't mention who that person is. You'll definitely get a pretty good glimpse into what is FinOps and actually how it's been executed out there in the industry. So the surprise will be revealed, but it's up to you whether you make it to it or not. Scott, next slide, please. So let's touch upon what actually is FinOps, right? What are the challenges that organizations face when they look to scaling cloud adoption, and specifically why FinOps is critical in 2020? So Scott, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please.
Yep.
You know, it's often quite common for us to hear people make statements like the following, right? The fact that your cloud costs are way too high, much higher than what you initially anticipated, or the fact that you perhaps forecasted 20 million pounds worth of cloud spend if you're a big spender and actually you're spending 30 million. How come the discrepancies? Or if you're a strategist, an architect, a CTO, you perhaps aren't seeing the cost benefit that you initially established as part of your cloud strategy. And eventually what you end up in a position where you've got engineers building stuff, finance can't control it, you've got finance putting guardrails that engineers can't consume, and frankly, you end up either stalling your cloud adoption, or your cloud adoption ends up getting a bad reputation for not delivering upon the promises that it was meant to. Or if you are delivering upon it, the cost at which that comes to the organization is way too high that the cost benefit doesn't actually weigh out. And frankly, the problem here is in cloud, right? So when we see these challenges, the problem here is in cloud. Unfortunately, it's your organization and the way in which you tackle it. And we'll look at why that is exactly the case. So Scott, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please.
Yep.
You know, if we were to look at public cloud spend and what organizations are predicted to be spending in the next couple of years, according to Gartner, public cloud spend is well on track to surpass more than 330 billion by 2022. And that's not a small number, certainly not one that I can spell correctly all the time. So it is pretty high and pretty substantial. However, to date, if we look at how organizations have managed and controlled their cloud spend, it's usually been engineering teams leading the effort, putting in some guardrails, and finance pretty much approving it at the end of the month, at the end of the quarter. Cloud costs across all the organizations has relatively been slow, right? You can have some organizations who are definitely high spenders, but the majority of them have taken quite a conservative approach at scaling their cloud adoption and have tried keeping it, you know, in the thousands or millions at most, low millions at most, single digits, but haven't tried surpassing that. And due to this traditional IT mode that organizations have been used to, CapEx has usually been king. People have classified IT spend and assets, looked to amortize it across X amount of years, and that spend has usually been allocated to projects. You separate it out across cost to build, cost to run, and you probably do something like a monthly or quarterly review of what you're spending. And you know, you're happy with that. And if someone's consuming cloud, great, we'll make sure the bill isn't too high. And finance and procurement teams haven't necessarily tried going onto the cloud consoles or the cloud cost management tools to look at the detail behind what is it that people are actually consuming. And that was okay. It was okay for up about till 2020, depending on the kind of organization that you are. But if we look at the current statistics for digital transformation and what that cloud spend is meant to be going forwards, finance has to be part of the architecture, right? If right now you're an organization who's just getting started, you need to be able to add some level of control without actually disrupting the developer experience. You need to know the fact that your cloud costs are most likely going to overshadow your on-prem costs in the coming years, and that's quite a shock to the system, right? Because the moment your operational spend, your operational expenditure is higher than your capital expenditure, you need to be able to figure out what does that actually mean to you, either if you're an accountant or if you're someone in procurement or if you're someone in your finance management team, what does that actually mean to you, right? And with an increased push out there of moving towards product aligned spend, product focused organizations, no longer are you going to have a project aligned allocation of what is it that you're spending. And the fact that you can implement things like financial guardrails as code, and the fact that you can make real-time decisions using a lot of the tools that you have, all of these are elements that come into the mix. And you need to figure out, what do I do, right? How do I cope with this? What's the impact to me? What does finance do now compared to what they used to do before? And
And don't
frankly,
forget,
this,
sorry, Deepak, and don't forget you want to add CI/CD and pipeline automation to put those guardrails in place so that you can sprawl way beyond what you would normally do manually at the console.
that's correct, right? No longer are you going to be able to click on a console and stop someone doing anything. So what does all this mean to you? Well, all of this spend is why FinOps is actually the savior for you, right? So if we go on to the next slide, please, Scott. FinOps is actually bringing together, it's an operating model and it's an approach where you bring together your finance teams, your procurement teams, and your engineering teams in order to break down the silos across these various functions and have a totally different approach when it comes to financial management, financial allocation, and financial agility in the world of cloud. Very similar to what DevOps and SRE did when you had developers and operation teams and within the engineering space not speaking to each other. FinOps is actually a collaborative approach where you have the functions who actually know what to do within their individual domains to collaborate and think about the trade-offs of consuming X amount of services, looking at what financial approach you're going to take when it comes to consuming cloud without compromising on things like your customer experience. You look at tracing your financial decision making based on data as opposed to a forecast that frankly no one is ever going to be subject to. But it also means, just like finance and procurement back in the day were perhaps the key gatekeepers of what you can or can't spend when it comes to buying an IT service or a piece of hardware, finance and procurement aren't the gatekeepers anymore, right? So what you have to figure out is, how does the notion of finance fit in as part of the core architecture when you're looking to build a product on cloud? And last but not the least, it's also about giving consuming teams the visibility of what is it that they're spending. Because if you can't tell someone what the impact of their engineering decisions are, you'll never get them to drive the right behavior that you are expecting from them. Scott, anything else you'd like to add to that?
I think metrics play a big role in that. In order to have that visibility, you have to have predefined metrics that are applicable and appropriate to the business so that you can track them in the kinds of things that are important for making business decisions.
That's correct. Thanks a lot for that, Scott. And if you feel Scott and I were waffling for too long, then one person who we definitely do have on the call isn't going to do that. So Scott, actually, if you could go on the previous slide again, please.
Sure.
As we promised, if you stayed on the call long enough, we'd introduce you to our special guest. And the special guest that we actually have here with us is none other than the person who was actually the president of FinOps himself, J.R. Storment. So J.R., over to you. What actually is FinOps?
Thanks, Deepak. Thanks, Scott. And apologies, my webcam is not working this morning for some reason. So I've been feverishly trying to get it going behind the scenes here, but not happening. So yeah, excited to be here to talk about this. President of the FinOps Foundation and co-authored the book on the FinOps strategy of cloud financial management with O'Reilly. And very excited to hear this sort of concept pushing out very much with these teams. I think Deepak did a great job to talk about the sort of longer term, but I would summarize this really as FinOps, cloud financial management, cloud cost optimization. All this is about getting the most value out of every dollar or pound spent on the cloud, right? That's the summary. And there's a lot of words that you can use to describe it, but there's 3 key points. The first is it's about upleveling the skills of people to better work in the cloud environment. It's putting in prescriptive processes that help define how you get allocation, visibility, optimization in cloud, and really defining a cultural shift in that. This cultural shift is critical because, as Deepak mentioned, you have 2 functions that have to come together in the past in ways they haven't. Finance teams, technology business teams, and the reason this is that cloud has really broken the traditional procurement model, right? You've got now engineers and technology teams grabbing whatever resources they need whenever they need them, which is fantastic for agility and innovation and delivering new products and be more competitive. But it's very challenging, to use a gentle word for it, when it comes to tracking against budgets, allocating spending, having a level of governance and controls. And so, FinOps and the work that FinOps Foundation does is really about getting those teams together so that they can develop a new common lexicon and drive better decision making, right? This area of cloud financial management, FinOps, whatever you're going to call it, is not necessarily about saving money, right? Optimization and savings is a part of it, but it's really about how do we make more money from our cloud usage? How do we ensure we're being efficient? And how do we like to talk about it in the iron triangle. There's the good, fast, or cheap, right? Pick one. And in some cases, you're going to use these processes to save money, maybe in a dev or staging environment, and another, maybe in a production data environment, you're going to spend more. But you want to enable your technology teams to make those decisions with an understanding that there's an impact to the spending and a collaboration with the finance teams and executive teams to understand how that impact is going to affect models, pricing, all the things that flow from there. So, when we talk about this space, people often go to, well, we're really just talking about a CapEx to OpEx change, right? And it's like, well, yeah, that is a big change, right? From cloud to, or from data center to cloud, and that does change how you're reporting on these things. But what this really brings is a behavioral change, right? You now need engineering tech teams to think about spending as a efficiency metric. You need finance teams to move out of the world of just reporting, quarterly or yearly, or forecasting on fairly static numbers, to really being FP&A partners, as mentioned here. They're not just gatekeepers; they become partners in this process. And really, I think the outcome you're looking for, again, you could say savings, but it's not. It's really shared accountability and responsibility. It's teams being able to look to say, we can make better decisions about our technology spend, and we can allocate that and charge that back appropriately. For the individual teams, I always like to think of it like what we call the Prius effect, which is, if you've ever driven an electric car, you want to give those teams, the same sort of feedback you get when you're driving an electric car. You put your foot down heavily on the pedal, and you see the energy flowing out of the battery, and you lift up on the pedal, and you see energy flowing back into the battery. You want to give that same sort of feedback loop to teams around cloud, so they can see when they make changes, how does that impact the business and the spend? And on the other side of that, you want to make sure that the executive teams, the financial teams, are able to accurately charge that back and allocate it in a world where, on the cloud, you've got hundreds of millions of charges for big spenders, down to seconds of resources or gigabytes of spend. So lots of areas we can cover there. I think Deepak and Scott have hit a lot of these. And one of the things that I think is critical as you're looking at this is, this is really not about a new technology, right? A lot of the conversations you see at the Amazon or Azure or GCP conferences are about the latest new technology that's out there. This is about up-leveling skills of people and putting new processes in place. And that I hate to use the word, but that transformation is challenging, right? And it's something that we look at. Most of the conversations that we have in the FinOps Foundation, which we'll talk a bit more here, but the end are not about technology or tooling. It's how do I get my teams up leveled? How do I set up the people, the processes, get that new operating model in place so I can take advantage of that financial agility? And it's one of the things that I think Contino does really well.
No, cheers. Thanks a lot for that, Jar. And you can have heard it from a person better than the person who's been the driving force in the industry, right? And I think if we were to go on to the next slide, frankly, a lot of times we have organizations ask the question, great, but what actually is the value of FinOps, right? Why should we actually do this? And JR touched upon some key points there, and Scott and myself, we sort of summarized some of these. Scott, did you want to cover what is the value to a CFO of adopting a FinOps based approach and operating model?
Yeah, and I think that the reason that we put this lighthouse here is that it's a beacon. It shows you where the pitfalls are. It guides you. I think that these bullet items that are called out that you can go ahead and elaborate on, they're really around kind of setting the path and guarding for the guardrails that we talked about earlier.
No, cheers. Thanks a lot for that, Scott. Yeah, so JR touched upon it. It's sort of knowing why is it that I've made certain decisions, but actually what the impact of that is. So if you were to look at initially, perhaps engineering teams have gone and made a purchase on your cloud platform, but actually, they have no visibility. And FinOps aims to increase that. It's making sure individual people actually have the traceability of the decisions of what they're doing. And the more the maturity increases within an organization, the closer you get to it, what is the impact of my decisions to our organization's goals, right? And that is kind of the closer you get to the impact to your wider organization goals, that is the improvement of your FinOps maturity. But it's also making decisions using data, right? As engineers that we are, it's often quite easy to make a decision on, I'm going to use a Kubernetes cluster and I'm going to overspec it because I hope that this will be the traffic that's looking to drive. But actually, if I'm not seeing the impact of what that is, and if I'm not using data correctly in doing things like right sizing, but also influencing that in my future architecture, then actually you haven't done things the right way, right? And FinOps aims to bring that impact together such that you can use that data to improve your future decision making. Obviously, we've talked about the fact that yes, there is the aspects of managing costs, but actually what we're moving towards is a cloud-first approach to managing costs, right? So the shift from CapEx to OpEx is a key one, but also knowing what financial mechanisms you have in place with the cloud providers is critical so that you know how the approach that you take as a finance team is different in the world of cloud compared to on-prem. But eventually, it's also empowering the product teams to be able to do that. So product teams should now be empowered to look at what the unit cost of their product is based on their cloud spend, such that they can make a decision and a trade-off on their architecture and whether it's worth spending X amount of money on a new feature. And if it is, then great. And if it isn't, then why you've made that decision. And it's down to the product teams to be able to do that. And last but not the least, it's also collaborating with teams that aren't particularly engineering focused, right? A lot of the stuff that JR talked about, it's a transformation in the way people work together. So if you move on to the next slide, please, Scott.
Yep. And keep in mind, it's a shift from the way that it was before. You're not going to the well for the money one time. You're getting the opportunity to rebuy those services on a daily basis, so you can be much closer to the decision-making process.
That is so true. Just to jump in, it's what happens in cloud that's so unique, and we talk about this a lot, is this idea of, you've got to get an iterative life cycle approaches going, because it's unlike buying in the data center where you buy the hardware and it's there for 3 to 5 years. Every day there's little tiny decisions being made by teams that add up to real impact on the business. So this muscle that you're building an organization is enabling all these teams to make those better decisions to work together.
Absolutely.
Spot on, guys. Couldn't agree more. So when we talk about, Jared just talked about decisions and knowing people how to make better decisions. One of the approaches that we use and one of the concepts that we preach out there when you look to do that is establishing something called a financial trace, right? And what we'll do in this section is go through actually what does the financial trace even mean? Because it might seem a random term. How do you establish one, and how does that fit in when you're looking to establish a FinOps function, and how do you execute upon that successfully? And a financial trace, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please, Scott. Just like engineers do when you build an application and you want to look at the performance of what your application's been, you put in tools to do the traceability of your application, right? To look at the performance of the application, where it's performing well, where it isn't, areas of optimization, and you're doing that real time, right? You can use debugging tools, you can look at the impact of what's happening. Is my file isn't loading quick enough? Have I done something wrong with my caching service? And you can take that as an approach to improve your service. Well, a financial trace is basically applying that same concept, but ironically to financial and cloud cost data, where you can look at actually what is the predicted spend that I initially planned, which is similar to what is the performance of my application that I wanted to have in the first place, and actually where are my actuals currently based on the real-time data that's been fed by the various tools that I'm looking to use. Now, the reason why financial trace becomes critical is because based on how far your predictions are compared to your actuals, you can actually use that to pinpoint down what are the events that have actually caused my cost to go up and down, and why am I so far off my initial predictability factor, right? And now that could just be that you've launched a new product, it could just be that you've released a new feature, and it could just be that you've perhaps changed the way in which you're consuming your service. You've moved to using reserved instances as opposed to on demand. And the problem here that we're trying to solve isn't the fact that our predicted and actuals aren't lining up, but actually it's the fact that we don't know why they aren't lining up, right? So knowing exactly why your costs have gone up and being able to attribute that to business decisions that you would have made or technical decisions that you've made is what we're trying to get to it. And yes, in an ideal world, if your actuals and predictability comes closer together, then hey, you've done a fantastic job of being able to manually predict that. There are obviously tools out there that you can use to do so, But what you want to avoid is the following. So if you go on to the next slide, please, Scott, what you want to avoid is the CFO coming up to you and asking you questions like, why is it that our costs have gone up, right? What is our forecast like? Do we know what is it that we're spending money on? So if we were to look at a lot of organizational factors that we can feed into almost like a finite state machine, which are things like your cost drivers, your business metrics, your forecasted spend, any architectural changes that you made, what's the business case behind consuming cloud. You want to be able to take a lot of these organizational factors, condense those into something useful in order to be able to make meaningful responses to all those questions that we have listed on the right hand side of the screen, such that you make sure that you've got the right level of control onto cloud. To JR's point, this is not about reducing your cloud spend. It's being able to have a meaningful discussion about your cloud spend and being able to action on top of it. Scott, anything else you'd like to add to that?
I think that the other thing that needs to be called out is as opposed to traditional monthly reviews, you're able to see minute by minute, hour by hour, or day by day feedback on those events and the correlation to the spend, and you can model and forecast aligned with the way that your business conducts business to be able to do that forward thinking and to do kind of a mid-month forecast of what your spend will be, what incremental changes might be along the way, and how that'll affect your final bill at the end of the month.
That's correct. That's a fair point, Scott. And later, sort of in this slide, we will touch upon how you can look to visualize your financial trace and what tools you could perhaps use for that as well. As JR touched upon, tooling is the least element when it comes to FinOps. But obviously, if you do have a organizational maturity that's able to cater for it, it certainly does help accelerate that journey. So if what we'll cover on the next slide is actually, we know what we want to achieve when it comes to financial trace, but how do we do it when it comes to the people? Because they're actually pretty critical to this entire function. So Scott, would you mind moving on to the next slide, please, and sort of walking us through what are the 3 legs to a successful FinOps execution?
Yep, so thanks. So I think that the thing about what we jokingly call the 3-legged stool, this is bringing finance and operations and engineering to the table together. Where it isn't so much that finance is coming in after the fact and saying, hey, you're overspending, you need to come and try and reduce spend, that they're a partner in the decisions around the business direction, both engineering and cloud operations. And whether or not it's any one of the public clouds that are influenced by these decisions, this makes it into a business function where they're collaborating as a team. And the team is unique to the organizational culture, and I think JR talked about that earlier, but fundamentally it's engineering, finance, and the business all coming together in order to make sure that they have a shared vision and multiple lenses that they're looking at the problem with and working together, rather than one coming in and being the governance role and smacking the hands of the engineering who are overspending and trying to meet business requirements, but it's like they're constrained. So this is an approach that fundamentally is really around a partnership within the organization to create this structure.
If you think about what the sort of right reasons, I think, for going to cloud are, right, it's not to get cheaper resources, because cloud is actually more expensive, sort of server per server, but it's really to empower and enable engineering teams to, move more quickly. I always love the Alaska Airlines CIO. He said they're not an airline, they're a software company with wings, because in the cloud economy, you need to be the best at delivering experience and features. And so you don't want to be in a place where you're smacking the hands of engineers. You want to move out of that model of control into the model of empower, help them go faster, help them ship more things, but at the same time, you need some governance and some visibility and guardrails as part of that process.
Absolutely.
That's correct. Sure, thanks, JR. So folks, if you what we've done for the first half of the session, we sort of talked about the conceptual aspects around FinOps, right, and the importance of a function like that to your organization. But we also appreciate that depending where you currently are on your organizational journey and your cloud adoption journey, FinOps at times can be quite daunting, right? If you don't know where exactly you want to start to, just like the same applied to the likes of DevOps, to site reliability engineering back in the day. In order to help simplify that, there is the notion of FinOps maturity, which is looking at where is it that you want to go organizationally speaking, and what are some of the key building blocks that you should put in place in order to be able to accelerate your FinOps journey. So what we'll like to do for the next part of the session is actually look at some key things that you can do, some tangible things that you can do to help you put those accelerators in place. And then depending on your organizational appetite and where you see cloud fitting in to your transformation journey, you can look at accelerating certain pillars within the FinOps maturity framework, as in how you go through it. So if you don't mind going to the next slide, please, Scott. We could probably skip the next one and go straight to the maturity model in itself. So FinOps maturity model gives you a pretty simple and easy approach. And maturity models have been around for a while, so you don't need to tell me what one of those are. But it gives you a pretty simplified approach of actually which stage am I currently at when it comes to a combination of my organizational journey of consuming cloud and my internal maturity of being able to start doing certain things to move to a FinOps-based approach. So what it does, it gives you the approach of crawl, walk, and run. So you start off right at the bottom, and what you want to do is make sure you've got the foundational building blocks ready, right? If you haven't got the ability to give someone the visibility into IT spend, there's no point you thinking about how to start doing team level budgets tracking, right? If you haven't got the ability to benchmark certain performance at a core drivers level, there's no point thinking about something more complex. So there are 6 key pillars that are important to understand here. One of them is being able to know exactly what your fully loaded costs are, right? If you don't know what your cost of doing business is, you're fundamentally doing something wrong when it comes to your core operations side of the business. If you don't know what are some of the key drivers that are looking to push those cloud costs up, that again, you've missed a trick on being able to figure out what your business metrics are. You need to be able to take the data that you have coming in from the tools and actually make some real-time decisions, and we'll go into what some of those are. But also then you can start using that data to now start predicting and planning accordingly when it comes to your future consumption of cloud. But also there's a very critical part of making sure you have IT, finance, and your line of business collaborating together in making sure the right guardrails, the right governance approaches are put in place such that you can start building FinOps as a mature capability in-house. Scott, anything else you'd like to add to that?
The one thing I did want to call out is that I think that the FinOps maturity is mutually exclusive of your cloud spend. You can be a big spender and be immature. You could be a small spender and just kind of putting your foot in the water and be highly mature in establishing the FinOps relationship with the business. So I think that that's just something that needed to be called out.
Now, that's a very fair point there, Scott. You don't have to have masses and masses of people as part of your FinOps function, but rather just having a very highly effective one and being able to move through these items. So if you go on to the next slide, please, Scott. A key approach that we usually recommend organizations take when you're actually looking to build out a FinOps function is actually establishing something called a FinOps policy. And a FinOps policy is very similar to, say, an expense policy within your organization, right? It's a document that you have people sign and attest to, saying the fact that, yes, we know the fact that cloud is a critical function within an organization, and we put our hands up to be able to consume cloud in a financially responsible manner. And what it does, it outlines a set of principles that you want everyone to follow within the organization, right? On screen, what we've done is we've used a very standard approach that we always recommend, and this is something a lot of CSPs also have as part of the cloud cost management function. But what becomes critical is actually what domains is it that you're looking to cover. So we talk about things like information access as part of your FinOps policy, right? So what is the kind of information that you are expecting to be able to gather from your cloud providers? So that's things like your cost and usage reporting, the visibility of the actual usage. If you reserve certain capacity, what does that look like? Being able to make sure you can organize that information into something more tangible, like your account structures, your subscription structures, making sure people are using the right tagging, the right cost categorization, the right cost allocation, being able to make sure you've got the right controls in place and the right mechanisms to understand that data, and then being able to take proactive steps to optimize your actual cloud spend. Now, what we usually recommend is the FinOps policy is something that's a theoretical approach on how you'd like to manage cloud going forward. But then what you do is that you actually add in accountable owners on certain things. So for example, the aspects around controls is something you can then give your engineering teams to say, these are the controls that we want to build. Go build these out as code. The aspect around optimization, you can actually give that to your FinOps function, saying we want you to drive the optimization as your activity with the engineering teams. The aspects around the organization side, you can give that to your cloud engineering teams, making sure they have the right guardrails in place and the right mechanisms in place to organize your cloud environment accordingly. So it gives you almost like a framework within your organization to work with. And then what we also recommend that you usually look at the coverage of your policy. So if you go out to the next slide, please, Scott, what we always advocate is making sure you're constantly checking how well your policy is being met, just like you tend to do with your expense policies or with your ethics and compliance policies. You want to make sure that all your employees are doing it. So we often recommend that you do reviews of how well is the FinOps policy is being followed within your organization, because it gives you as a wider company something to work with, and also it kind of highlights areas of improvements, right? Which you can then map back to your FinOps maturity. So for instance, if you aren't reserving any capacity at all, right, and you're probably, let's say, consuming £4 to £5 million or dollars a year, then perhaps you're missing a trick there, right? You haven't necessarily done something the right way. So it also gives people a food for thought on aspects that they should be considering to doing better that they might not have considered already. Scott, anything else you'd like to add?
I think that whole spend conversation is one that is a partnership between those who have the funds and those who are operationally making those decisions. And I think that it gives you a different perspective to look at decisions around spend that aren't necessarily triggered exclusively by trying to get the consumption working. It's much more around, what makes sense and how can we save some money as a byproduct. And those savings are often extrapolated to additional consumption in the cloud. So it one hand actually benefits the other.
Fair point, Scott. And what we have on the next slide, is an example of how you can tie aspects of your FinOps policy to the actual execution, right? So one of the aspects of the FinOps policy talks about organization level tagging. Scott, do you want to talk about those, for example, how you can approach something like that?
Yep, tagging is absolutely paramount for a successful FinOps practice because it ties in with how you normally do housekeeping, your CI/CD, and your CMDB work where you're trying to keep track of the assets. The data that you are tagging allows you to use different perspectives of looking at that information in order to answer questions. So whether or not they're at the application level so that you can figure out what your crown jewels are, whether or not it's around automation for governance, whether or not it's around security and compliance, or if they're just business level, those tags used in the right filtering allow you to have visibility around those assets out in the cloud and then tie back to your traditional methods for managing those inventories.
No, I couldn't agree more there, Scott. So, brilliant. We've created a policy. We know on paper what is it that we got to do. Now we just got to go and do it, right? Bro. Okay, so we've established a tagging policy and we've now put that in place. But are we anywhere closer to establishing a financial trace? Well, you aren't, because one thing that we haven't done is actually establish your cost drivers. And this actually becomes quite fundamental when you're looking to tie your cloud costs to the reason of being able to answer the question of why have my costs gone up. And the cost driver is actually meant to help you do that. So fundamentally, the way in which we tend to break it out is that you have 4 key technical cost drivers that are going to make your cloud costs go up and down, right? And they can be easily broken into consumption of new cloud services. So you're consuming something that you never did before. You're looking to scale your existing ones. So you're perhaps increasing the size of your data lake or your Kubernetes cluster. You're changing the financial approach of using those services. So you might have agreed an ELA with a cloud service provider, or you're going to reserved instances, you're going to spot, or you suddenly now switch back to on demand. Or perhaps the architecture of your workload hasn't necessarily been well suited to a cloud provider. So you may be moving away from virtual machines onto running it as functions, right? All of those things are fundamental things that impact your cost driver. What we look to do is actually establish these 4 key things as something that you can map back to your cloud costs, and then either work your way upwards. So if your cloud costs, had gone up because your consumption of services had been scaled, brilliant. Why was that the case, right? So being able to map it back to your technical impact, and that could just be that you've looked to scale it because you wanted to handle new new volumes or new additional client requests, then you should look to then tie that back to, okay, what was the business metric that we were trying to achieve in order to do that? And that could have been that you were trying to increase the number of monthly active users. And then you should tie that back to business objectives, right? Which could have been grow your user base. Now, depending on how mature you are on your organizational journey, if you are already spending cloud and you want to bring it into control, you probably will take a bottom-up approach. Whereas if you're someone who's already quite mature and you want to do it the other way around, then actually, and you're just starting off with cloud, then you probably start off all the way from the top and make sure any work that you do, any feature that you prioritize actually has this mapping in place such that you can tie back your cloud cost to your actual cost drivers. And on the next slide, Scott's going to actually walk us through another example, right, of what one example mapping or something like this could look like.
Yep. So this is a bottom-up approach, as you described, and this is trying to make sure that it's in line with what the business's goals are, and to see whether or not, as we talked about before, where the policy remediation is in place. So you're looking from the bottom up, and you're leaning towards the business objectives, using the metrics and the impact to help you get there. This is just a different way, whether it's a bottom up or a top down, it's going to be aligned with the business culture and the organizational approach.
Sounds good. Cheers. Thanks, Scott. So if you go on to the next slide, please. So we've established a cost driver. It's brilliant, right? So a cost driver gives us a pretty good measure of being able to say why our cloud costs have gone up, right? So what was the direct reason why it went up? But actually, the other thing you have to consider is what was the benefit of that cloud spend to us, right? So drivers is one thing and it gives you the reason behind it, but actually what was the organizational impact of doing such a thing? Now, there are various different ways in which we can do it, but we always advocate the notion of a cloud benefits framework. And on screen, you can see a sample sort of use cases that, you've probably heard organizations when looking to go onto cloud time and time again. But a simple mapping of the way in which we tend to break it is, cloud gives you benefits across the arenas of performance, business agility, customer and developer experience, security, additional optimizations compared to existing IT spend. What we always recommend is that you take this, tailor this to your organization, and map out what are the benefits that you intend to see, or what are the key reasons why you are looking to consume cloud, right? I'd probably recommend not focusing on that much on the IT ones, although at times they are needed, like, perhaps it's cheaper than you for running it on cloud than it is on-prem, but actually focusing more on what are going to be the additional experiences that you enable for either your customers, your developers, and then being able to tie that back to your cloud spend. Some of these benefits can be tangible, some of the other ones can be intangible, and even those do have calculation mechanisms. Like, you can have a debate whether productivity is something that you can manage or not, but they certainly do provide the executive leadership some visibility around what are the organizational benefits that we've unlocked when looking to use cloud. And you can also apportion and tie that back to your actual cloud spend that we'll look to cover in the coming slides, how you can tie your cloud spend to the actual benefits that you uncovered as part of that. Scott, anything else you'd like to add?
Nope, I think you covered that one very well.
And then I guess the last bit to consider, right, is visibility. Often developers, definitely in the case of on-premise, unless you're a very mature organization, usually never actually knew the impact of what their cloud spend is and what the number associated against is. But now in the world of cloud, you certainly can do that. A trick that we often see organizations miss is that they go and procure tons and tons of tools and think that suddenly they're not FinOps enabled. And to JR's point, tools and technology is actually the last part of this. The key part is the way in which you work, right? So our recommendation always is enable visibility for the people who need to know what the impact of the decisions are. And frankly, the cloud service providers nowadays give you a very mature set of tool sets, right? Perhaps it wasn't the case 4 or 5 years ago, but over the last couple of years, based on internal development and acquisitions, they've all built a fantastic set of capabilities. Use those cloud service provider native tools first. Look at integrating those as part of your financial processes. Perhaps it's things like general ledger reconciliation or part of your chargeback, showback, and sharing back process. Look at doing that first, build that engineering and in-house FinOps maturity muscle, and then look at going to either cross-cloud, third-party, or open source tools out there that might add some additional maturity to your FinOps journey. Don't look to jump on a tool, because actually if you're using tooling as an excuse, you're probably doing something wrong, because actually there's a fairly mature set of tools already out there within the cloud service providers to give you that right level of visibility. Scott, next slide, please. And last but not the least, how do you bring it back together, right? How do you bring back the visibility of your cloud spend? How do you take your cost drivers? How do you take your benefits and everything else and bring it into something more concise? Well, that exactly is the financial trace, right? So going back to the first point that we talked about, if we were to look at, say, a benefit that we look to uncover all the way at the left, which could be resilience, right? One of the metrics that you could have added to the resilience standpoint is that we want to move to an availability target that's 99%. Brilliant. You know, well, what's going to be the way in which we implement this? Well, the way in which we want to do that is we want to, you know, deploy multiple instances across multiple availability zones, which has an impact onto our compute consumption. And guess what? You can then map it back to your cost driver. Brilliant. You're scaling the consumption of your existing services. Or if as an organization you already are spending cloud a fair amount and you can't take that top-down approach, you can almost work your way backwards, right? You can start simple. You can look at your core cost drivers first, look at the impact to your technical implementations actions that you've taken as part of that, and then map that back to your organizational drivers and business metrics. So depending on where you are on your financial journey, it gives the financial trace gives you a pretty good horizontal, vertical cut throughout your entire organization, being able to know the decision that a C-level made all the way down to the actual cloud spend that you've incurred. And if you don't mind going to the next slide, please, Scott. That very much can then be represented onto a simple executive dashboard, right? JR talked about initially the Pierce effect. You know, this is almost like an executive version of that to a certain extent, where you can have a real-time view of your cloud costs on the top. You know, this is just a mock-up, but you can look at actually what are my actual cloud spend coming in all in real time. What's my projected forecast? Also data that you now get from your cloud service provider tools by default. And you can overlay on top of that your organizational summary of the benefits and the cost drivers, and knowing where you currently stand in being able to map where you currently are when it comes to controlling those and being able to action upon those as you look to progress with your organizational journey around cloud adoption. Scott, anything else that you'd like to add to that?
Nope, I think that's spot on. The KPIs and communicate within an organization are paramount to the overall success. You can't underestimate the value of the communication in an organization.
Sure, thanks for that, Scott. So if we look at what does good actually look like, right? If you want to move towards increased maturity, there are two key things that we'd probably suggest, right, as your North Star. One of them we already talked about, which is finance and engineering partnership, and making sure you bring a lot of these different functions together and talking together. But the other bit, which is what Scott you talked about, right, which is actually how can you look at over time as your maturity increases, decreasing the unit cost of cloud, right? So it's not reducing your cloud spend, but rather making sure the cost of doing business in cloud eventually goes down, right? And that comes down to your maturity.
Yep, absolutely.
So if you are, if you are adventurous and you want to look at actually what does the future behold for you, well, FinOps isn't just doing the core building blocks that we talked to you about, right? In line with the FinOps maturity framework, you can certainly start doing things that are a bit more advanced. That would include things such as how you start integrating FinOps as core part of your demand management function. Look at how you can start doing more advanced capabilities of chargeback and showback for your shared services, and there are multiple approaches to doing that as well. Look at using the marketplace from the cloud service providers to fulfill your software procurement process. You can build a dedicated FinOps team. To Scott's point earlier, FinOps maturity isn't tied to how much you're spending, but rather how you're spending. You can then look at advanced tools that can help you with things like unit-based pricing, multi-cloud benchmarking, and eventually achieving that FinOps nirvana, right? And frankly, you can pluck and choose any one of these based on where you are on your maturity journey. You don't have to follow that road, but it certainly gives you some additional food for thought around aspects you could be considering when you're looking to build out a FinOps function.
Yep.
Scott, anything else you'd like to add to that?
Nope, I think, as you said, the economies of scale absolutely apply in this case. So
sounds good. Cheers. Thanks, Scott. Now, FinOps, as we talked about, if you're looking to embark upon the FinOps journey, you guys certainly aren't alone. There's a massive community of people out there, and they all currently sit under the foundation of the FinOps Foundation, headed up by JR. who's going to be able to walk us through, how is it that you guys can get involved? What does the community actually do, and the benefits that can bring to your organization going forward, right? JR, would you mind walking us through that, please?
Yeah, definitely. So, a little bit of background on how the FinOps Foundation came to be. It's a nonprofit trade association that's really focused on up-leveling the skills of people. And I had spent the last 9 years. I co-founded Cloudability back in 2011, and over the 9 years of working with some of the world's largest cloud spenders, I kept running into the same questions from people, which was, as we said, it's not always just about the technology. They kept asking, like, well, how do we help up level our people? How do we do the cultural change? What team do I set up? Where does it report? Who should I hire? How do I get those people who are in the data store world transitioned? So we put together this organization that initially started with 20, I think it was 26 charter members of people who I'd met over the years who were doing this at scale, and got this group together to really start to share best practices around those areas, to help to codify some of the standards, to create a community. And in the last year, it's gone from those 26 original charter members to now over 1,400 members. There's over 500 companies in there who have over $1 billion a year in revenue. So we've got a range of giant companies, the Fortune 500s and FTSE 100s, all the way over to the the tech unicorns like the Atlassians and Spotify's on the other end of that. And it's really focused on the people side, right? So we do a lot of work around community engagement. So there's calls about twice a month where we get typically 200-300 practitioners on a Zoom call to just talk about how do you set this up in your organization? What are the challenges? We also, on the back of all that learning, Mike Fuller, who's one of the original founding board members, and I co-authored the Cloud FinOps book that O'Reilly published in January. That's really a collection of the stories and best practices we've heard from these groups. And that's now gone into a FinOps certification that we run trainings on just about weekly now. There's actually one happening right now virtually that I'm going to jump back over to once I'm done with this, where people from the tech side who want to learn more about the finance, people from the finance side who want to learn more about the cloud, set up this model, come together to get certified. And ultimately, those people are sharing knowledge and best practices in the Slack channel and various areas. So really great thing to get involved with regardless of your maturity. We find there's people from sort of all clouds, all levels of maturity, and all levels of sort of whether it be tool usage or cloud spend as well. So invite you to check out finops.org, become a part of that conversation, and hope to see you over there. I know we're short on time, so I will stop talking so we can leave a few minutes for Q&A if we're going to do that.
No, cheers. Thanks a lot for that, JR. And highly recommend you all checking out finops.org, because actually the value and the kind of content being covered out there by the community is absolutely amazing. So what we thought is, we leave the last 5 minutes out for questions out there. So if you do have any, please do type in the chat window. And we also wanted to, put a poll out there for you. Today what we very much covered is basically based on the basics of FinOps and what is it as a concept. But there's a lot of details behind actually approaches and mechanisms that you can look to implement within your organization. So if that is a topic that you are interested in, we'll be putting a poll in right now in the next couple of minutes. Do vote, and if there is enough interest, we'd look to run further calls with additional practitioners around some of these key approaches that we've seen work well within Contino. And if not, you can always take out additional content on the FinOps Foundation website, which also covers a plethora of those. Scott, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. I think with that in mind, folks, that pretty much brings today's webinar to an end. Contino CloudFest is going to continue. So with these strange times, people are asking for ever more content than they did previously. So we'll continue producing a lot more thought-provoking content in the way of webinars, blog posts, podcasts on our website. You can check out more about a lot of the content that we talked about today around FinOps on the blog post that you've got linked down there. And as always, you can tap us up on Contino.io for any further questions.